Alright boys, this is gonna be a bit of a long one. Despite my channel primarily being about Injustice 2, this video is not. This video is about a much larger concern of mine, which is the fighting game genre. I want fighting games to be the largest esport in the world, mainly because I love watching them. I don't really enjoy playing team games as much because it's hard for me to, or at least competitively, because it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly what went wrong in each game when you lose. Even when you win, you should still be able to point out mistakes you made, and it's kind of hard to do that in a team game, at least for me personally, because so much of your fault can be boiled down to other people. Like if you die as a damage character, did you necessarily put yourself out of position, or was the team supposed to follow up, or, you know, it's hard to be able to tell those things, where in a fighting game it's much more one-dimensional, and it's easier to be able to tell, okay, clearly I did something wrong there, because everything comes down to your decision. There's no one else impacting your play. However, despite all of this, the fighting game genre is still quite a small blip on the radar of esports. And in this video, I'm going to lay out why I think that is, and things fighting games developers can do in order to help and remedy this problem. Let's first of all address the problem. Let's find out what the problem is. The problem, based on what I can tell, is player retention. If you don't really understand what player retention is, basically it's a measurement of active players. An example of a game with higher player retention would be Overwatch, League of Legends, Hearthstone, and basically all the top games on Twitch, because Twitch roughly has a correlation with player retention, although not 100% accurate. If a game has a high amount of viewers on Twitch, it probably has a pretty decent player retention, outside of like anomalies like tournaments and things like that. And for example, a game with a low player retention would be something like DayZ, since it's a big crash and burn, or really any sports game, because despite sports games doing very well on sales, they just don't do very well past that. Generally, they have a pretty quick drop-off of player retention. Now, what exactly fuels player retention? How do we get more people actively playing fighting games? Because sales on fighting games are definitely not the issue. They do pretty well. The problem is keeping people playing fighting games. Well, let's look at some games with high player retention. These are the top 10 games on Steam right now, measured by player activity. We're not going to count Payday 2 in this because it's recently gone completely free to play, so there's a massive spike in players, as you guys can see on that chart. But all of these games that are in these red boxes here, who can point out what similarities these games have? What do they share in common? Well, it's a bit of a trick question because they share quite a lot in common, but I'm going to go through all those things that they share, and we should try to incorporate these things into fighting games. So, first of all is cosmetics. Cosmetics are so important for making a healthy and stable online game, because it keeps people coming back because they want to unlock those cosmetics, or, you know, they see them and they get intrigued, and I'm sure a psychologist could better break down exactly why cosmetics help increase player retention, but in my basic layman's terms, they're pretty and people want them. Just look at Overwatch. Overwatch is able to sustain having free DLC maps and free characters purely because of its cosmetic system, and I mean, just look at its viewership on Twitch. It spikes like crazy, and also its player retention probably spikes like crazy whenever they do one of these in-game events like Christmas or the recent anniversary event that happened. And it looks like the same thing's going to happen with Battlefront 2, because they've already confirmed that the game will have cosmetics in it, and they've recently confirmed that the game will have free DLC. Just look at Counter-Strike. Among the competitive community in that game, CSGO was considered one of the worst entries in the series. The active players weren't very high, and the viewership on Twitch was little to none, until they added the cosmetic system, which made the game blow up. Active players and viewers on Twitch skyrocketed, and to this day is one of the largest games on the planet, despite having one of the worst cosmetic systems, in my humble opinion. The next big thing these games share in common is ease of access. This is true for almost every game besides fighting game. Cast a spell in Dota, you press a key on your keyboard. To shoot a gun in Counter-Strike or PUBG, you left-click on your mouse. In a fighting game, in order to cast an ability, you need to do a number of things, the easiest of which is down forward 1. And I understand if you've been playing fighting games for a long period of time, and you don't see the problem with that, but try to hear me out. Fighting game inputs, the way they're currently done, I'll now refer to them as directional inputs, but like down, forward, 1, that type of stuff, are based off of a really old design philosophy because they had a limited amount of buttons in the arcades and even on the early consoles. But these days, controllers have so many more buttons, and this directional system has only stuck around because of tradition. If you don't see how it could be possible to do a fighting game without traditional directional inputs, let me lay out one possibility for you. Keep in mind that this is just one. It doesn't need to be done this way but this is one way it could be done. Currently in fighting games, we have a right analog stick, which is not used at all. Between up, down, left, right, and even just clicking on the right stick, we have 5 abilities right there, and if you need more than 5 abilities, well then you could do the same inputs but while holding down R2, and now you have up to 10 abilities, and past that point you can do even more things to incorporate the right stick in order to get some abilities out. But I really don't think you need more than 10 abilities. Obviously there have been fighting games where characters have more than 10 abilities, and you can totally make that work, but you don't have to. Obviously this is a pretty simple system I've managed to come up with in less than 10 minutes, and it already has some flaws in it, like for example, fight sticks would be useless. You would have to make a new type of fight stick to incorporate this type of ability. I don't think that's a horrible thing, but it's probably worth keeping in mind when developing a game. Fight sticks aren't super common among general consumers, and this is not the only way one-button abilities could be done. There's totally other ways of doing it. In fact, it has been done other ways before. Some people might be worried about balancing, because for example, in fighting games currently, if a move is a little bit more powerful than the rest of your abilities, like for example, Scarecrow's command grab, to make up for that, the ability is a down, back, forward movement, which is noticeably more difficult than a traditional down, forward, or down, back movement to make up for how much more powerful it is than his other abilities. This concern about balancing is valid, but try to remember that every fighting game you've played, or at least most of them that you've played, has been designed with directional inputs heavily in mind. It's at the core of their game. Imagine if Injustice 2 was designed with one-button abilities instead of directional inputs. Deadshot probably would end up having a cooldown system on most of his abilities, making his full-screen game much weaker, but because of that, he would probably be given more close pressure tools, or like more get off me abilities or something like that. A game to look at to see this idea in action is Rising Thunder. I'm going to link in the description a tournament that was played for Rising Thunder before unfortunately it was cancelled and shut down. It was early access footage, but you can see very high level gameplay for a fighting game without directional input. For people who are still worried about balance, let me ask you a question, and this isn't supposed to be rhetorical or condescending, it is a genuine question. Do you think the top 5 players in Mortal Kombat, Injustice, Street Fighter would be any different at all if directional inputs weren't in those respective games? I personally don't think so, because the execution difficulty with combos, in my opinion, is not relevant. That difficulty only comes in while learning the combo. After that, it all becomes repetition. It's rare to see people in high-level tournaments drop combos unintentionally. Sometimes they'll drop it intentionally in order to continue it later and get more damage. And even when you do see people unintentionally drop a combo, it's not necessarily because of directional inputs. In fact, I would argue it just isn't. Obviously, in some cases it will be, but very rarely, I think. I'm not asking for them to incorporate automatic combos into fighting games, that's a little bit absurd. I'm asking for one-button abilities, because the only thing directional inputs contribute to is the barrier of entry for fighting games, and that is a massive problem, because in order to create a healthy player base, we need people playing the game. And in other games, it's much easier for the matchmaking system to find somebody of your skill level. However, because of the player retention problem, we don't have enough people online to accurately find you an opponent of equal skill level every time, which only inflates the barrier to entry problem. The final thing these games share in common besides GTA is that they're pretty cheap. They're not a $60 game, and in some cases they're even straight up free to play. In a dream world, we would have a game with all of these mechanics that I've mentioned in this video, on PC and on the consoles, I guess, but primarily on PC because that's where you can really drive a big esports community. Traditionally, it's much easier to drive an esports community on PC than it is on a console. Have a good cosmetic system, and one-button abilities. The fact that a game like this doesn't exist currently in 2017 is kind of embarrassing. The best way to do this is the same way that Smite does it, which is the game is free to play but limits you on characters and cycles them out weekly. But have the option to pay $30 to $40 to get access to all of the characters in the game and future characters that haven't been added yet. Smite has proven this can work, and it's amazing for both the consumer and the publisher. The consumer is allowed to play the game before committing any money to it, and the publisher gets more people actively playing the game, which is good for many reasons that I won't bother going to in this video because this video is already going to be probably pretty long. Some examples of games that have tried to do this are Rising Thunder, previously mentioned in this video, but also a game called Fantasy Strike, which is currently under development and being funded entirely by the fans. Both of these games intended to be free to play, and as far as I'm aware, Fantasy Strike still intends to be free to play once it has launched. Both of these games intend to be on PC, although Rising Thunder of course was cancelled, but both games have one-button abilities, and they both intend to have some type of cosmetic system. It's hard to tell exactly what that cosmetic system would be because Rising Thunder was shut down and Fantasy Strike is still in very early development. Another game which has done most of these things is Brawlhalla. Brawlhalla is a much closer game to Smash Brothers than it is to anything like MK or Injustice or Street Fighter but it does share a lot of these things I mentioned in this video. One button abilities, free to play on PC, cosmetic, and even the system I was talking about earlier on in this video where you can spend X amount of money to get access to all of the characters and future characters, kind of like an infinite season pass. And as a result, the game has an incredibly healthy player retention to the point where I, an Australian player, is able to find a match in my area in all of the playlists almost instantly, which is insane. But Brawlhalla did certainly not break the esports world. What I've been talking about in this video is a reimagining of fighting games and the way that they're designed, in order to step up the quality and interest of the genre. There are a few developers which could pull something like this off, while also making both a polished game and giving that game a large audience. My number one pick for a developer to make this game would be Blizzard. Blizzard Entertainment has a huge history of taking genres and completely redesigning them into a standard and a norm for the genre. They did this with MMOs. MMOs looked very different before World of Warcraft. They did this with card games. Card games looked very different before Hearthstone. They did this with first-person shooters. Overwatch, while sharing similarities with Team Fortress 2 and other games before it, Overwatch definitely went a step further by having the game be completely class-based and having that many different classes, and even did a lot with map design that we haven't seen before from other developers. And cosmetics as well. They did a fantastic job with their cosmetic system. They even did this with MOBAs to some extent. Traditionally, MOBAs have one map and one objective. You usually have an ADC, a tank, support, and a mid player, where Heroes of the Storm has a massive map pool and ton of varieties in both objectives and roles. And in the past, Blizzard has even teased a fighting game, although this was an April Fool's joke. It certainly got me excited. Another developer is Riot Games. Normally, if you ask my opinion on Riot Games, my answer would be fairly straightforward. I don't really like them. That being said, remember that game Rising Thunder I talked about earlier on in this video? Riot Games was the company that bought them out, saying that the team that was working on Rising Thunder has moved on to bigger and better things, and they couldn't actually talk about the project they were working on. To this day, that bigger and better thing hasn't been talked about or revealed to us in any way. Personally, I think that they're working on a Rising Thunder style game, but set in the world of League of Legends. I think either of these two developers could take the fighting game genre, which is effectively a pretty small genre and just a tiny part of the esport world, and turn it into one of the largest esports. I'm talking up there with Overwatch, League of Legends, Counter-Strike, and as you can tell by this pretty long video, I've thought a lot about this, and I hope the developers do as well, because this is a game that would personally change the way I look at fighting games, and it would create for an experience that we haven't had before in this genre. Anyway, that's been my thoughts on the topic. Let me know what you think after watching this video. I'm actually really curious if I changed any of your minds about anything I mentioned in this video. My name is Mabilbzy, and I will see you in the next video.
Holy mackerel.